you'll be all set.
Well, good morning. It looks like we've got participants starting to load into the to our program today. So thank you for joining us. This is a kind of an ongoing series we're doing through the Chamber and our COVID response plan. And today we are talking about PPP and how to get it all forgiven and actually get all your sins in life forgiven. You're going to learn how to do that through JRBT today because they know how to do all that. But really excited to have a couple of guests with us today. We got Tyler Ryan and Michael Brown, both with JRBT. Michael's a shareholder there, and Tyler's a senior manager, and they work with the PPP program. But before we dive into their program, I do want to thank our sponsors today. First National Bank of Central Texas is our presenting sponsor, and Spectrum Reach is our gold sponsor. We're so thankful for them. That's how we are able to create great content at the Chamber is through our sponsorships. So if you're looking for something to sponsor, please call. I'm sure we can find something for you right away. All right, guys. I know this PPP has been a very exciting and dynamic program since its inception. Probably most people on the listening in today, including myself, are participants in that program. And so looking forward to hear some expertise from you guys on how to handle it. I will say JRBT has been a long time involved with the Chamber for a long time, but also just involved in the community a long time. You guys told me that's been around for over 100 years. So you should have been able to figure something out by now after 100 years. And we'll show you for our audience too, the over 100 employees at JRBT serving clients, not only just locally, but also regionally across the nation and even outside of the US in some cases. So there's a lot of expertise in that firm. Also in 2014, one of the R in the JRBT, Mike Rittmeyer was the Chamber chairperson, and so we're thankful for his service and thankful for you guys here today. And for our audience also to know, we've also got Matt Metters on. You see his face there as well. Matt and I will be handling the Q&A. So as you hear the program, if you have questions, you can go to the Q&A icon down at the bottom of your screen. Type in your question, and we will make sure those get asked at the end. And then Matt will excuse us at the end of the program. All right. With that being said, Michael, Tyler, you guys take it away.
Hey, Rick. Thanks for the introduction. We appreciate the opportunity to be here with y'all, and we've JRBT, like Rick said, has long been a supporter of the Chamber, and we like to ask Mike Rittmeyer what it was like 100 years ago when the firm was started. But yeah, we enjoy working with the Chamber. I do want to mention, Rick, something you said. We are dealing with forgiveness in a non-theological sense here. Anything beyond that is up to y'all. We can help you with your forgiveness of the PPP loans, though. Also, anything the obligatory disclaimer here is that anything we say today is the information that we know of it as of today. There's additional legislation in the works. There's additional guidance in the works. So everything is as we know it today. And that is all subject to change because we've seen it change over and over and over again. So the other thing is I do want to thank our local bankers here in Waco, Texas. Some of them are the sponsors of this program. The Waco bankers have done a phenomenal job of helping their clients in our community in getting the PPP funding out to their customers. which has really buoyed this community and helped the businesses keep the payroll going and keep people employed and keep the paychecks coming and help keep our economy going. So that they've really done a great job. So what I'm going to start off with is kind of the current status of the PPP program. And then we're going to move on from there and talk about the process of getting forgiveness for your PPP loans. So right now, as it stands, the program is set to expire on August the 8th. So meaning for the origination of new PPP loans. So what some people may not realize is the PPP program is still open and there still is funding available. As of July 24th is the last update we have. There's still $130 billion of funds remaining that's authorized to be expended in the program. And it's been kind of hovering about that for a while. So there's still money left. Go talk to your banker if you have not gotten a PPP loan and feel like you need one. Right now, the thing we're waiting on is the next round of legislation. As you may know, the Republicans and the Democrats in Congress are currently, yesterday and today, negotiating, and probably a couple more days in the future, the fourth round of COVID stimulus bills or packages. The Senate Republican bill was was introduced yesterday, and it's a $1 trillion package. And the House Democrat package was passed back in May by the House and has sat waiting to be taken up, and it's a $3 trillion package. So they're trying to reconcile the differences and come up with a negotiated solution. And Congress is scheduled to recess for most of the month of the month of August. So they kind of have a short period of time to negotiate and pass a bill if they want to accomplish something before the PPP program expires and before the unemployment benefits expire this Friday, I believe.
Yes. Yep.
Yeah. So what is good about these, both the Democrat package and the Republican package, is that they both include an expansion or extension of the PPP program. And actually a second round where businesses that qualify, the qualifications will be more stringent, but businesses that do qualify could come back for additional PPP funds. And that's supported by both parties. That second round, what is agreed to at this point, as far as we know, would allow borrowers with less than 300 employees. So that's down from the 500 employee cap previously. So it's affecting or impacting smaller borrowers. And additionally, they would have to have experienced a decline in revenue of greater than 50%. So a business with 300 employees or less that has in fact experienced a decline in revenue of 50% would qualify for a second round of PPP loan. And right now it's proposed that second round would include an additional $100 billion of funding. So probably it would roll up the first round remainder of $130 billion, put another $100 billion on top of that, so $230 that could go to smaller businesses that have experience, that can document a revenue decline. So that's a good news for businesses that are continuing to struggle and that would meet that qualification. Additionally, both parties have introduced bills that would require the SBA to create a streamlined forgiveness application attestation form that would be 1 page long that could be used by borrowers that have loans of less than $150,000. So for quite some time, there's been talk and pressure from various interest groups or business interest groups wanting to get a streamlined forgiveness process for smaller loans. And there's been different thresholds that have been discussed about what is a small loan. They've talked about 150, 250, 350. But the fact is, if they had a blanket forgiveness process for loans of under $150,000, it would cover 85% of the loans issued by number, not by dollar amount, but by number. And the whole idea behind that, really, and why it's a good thing, number one, is it's easier to get the forgiveness taken care of, but it reduces the administrative burden on the banks and reduces the administrative burden on the SBA, and is a better result for the borrowers. So that's the thinking behind that. I hate saying I can't imagine something like that wouldn't happen, but the politicians seem to be behind it, and the Treasury Department has signaled support for that type of result. So I think they'll probably get there on something like that. So that goes into one. I mean, and we'll talk about it in a minute, but that may be one of the reasons why you might want to wait for your forgiveness application to apply, because they may be coming out with this simplified form that I believe I read through the bill or the proposed bill. I don't think you would have to provide any supporting documentation with it. You would just have to make the attestation and provide the numbers. Tyler, have you heard that any differently?
I haven't heard that any differently, and on that point, I think that's a good segue into timing. And just to reiterate there, especially for the borrowers that are under the $150,000 threshold, I don't think there's no negative impact to waiting. I think anybody that's looked at these or did receive a PPP loan, we're several weeks into the program here. Most borrowers who were in the early rounds back in April are past their 8 weeks and somewhere into the 24-week period. I'll take a step there to say, going back in June, there was new guidance that was passed that extended the covered periods from 8 weeks to 24 weeks. And so now borrowers have a longer period of time to use those PPP funds. And, that's a huge advantage to get 24 weeks now, because you got 24 weeks to effectively spend, what was it? It was a month and a half. It was 9.5 or
10 weeks.
10 weeks.
Yeah.
10 weeks of, I'm doing bad math here. Not
Right.
Advertising good, but
2.5 months, which was about 10 weeks. Yeah.
Yeah, you've got effectively 24 weeks to spend 10 weeks of funds. And so when do we apply for these things? That's a common question we're getting these days. It's not like a tax return where there's a set deadline for everybody. It's all dependent upon when you did get your loan, because the day that you received your funds is the first day of your covered period in most situations, unless you're electing an alternative covered period. But the day you received your funds is the start, and then from there we back out to the 8 weeks or the 24 weeks. And so, the first payment on any part of the loan that's not forgiven is due 10 months from the end of the covered period, the 24 weeks, and that's assuming that no forgiveness application has been submitted. And so, in theory, the due date, so to speak, is 10 months from the end of your 24-week covered period, which, again, assuming you were a borrower in April, the 24 weeks puts you in early October time frame for the end of your 24 weeks. So your 10 months puts you into
10 months on top of that.
Yeah, your 10 months on top of that puts you next summer, next June or July, depending on time frame of getting the loan.
And that's not actually a due date. That's the earliest time you would have to begin repaying the loan.
That's the earliest time.
Most people would want to file a forgiveness application before they have to start repaying.
Sure, we don't want everybody. I would not want to wait until the last second to do there, but I'm saying that just to give a little comfort in the fact of there's no harm in waiting in that time period. As anyone who's paid attention to this program has seen, the changes have been constant in this, and there's still guidance that we're waiting. There's lots of unanswered questions.
And just to clarify, you don't pay any interest on the forgiveness portion.
No,
the SBA is responsible for paying the interest on the portion of the loan that's forgiven. So you're not paying a financial penalty for waiting to apply.
Right. And I think one other tidbit I would throw in there, on the timing, once you do submit your forgiveness application, the lender's got 60 days to make a decision. And then once they make a decision, they pass their decision over to the SBA, and the SBA's got 90 days. So you've got another 150, theoretically, at maximum 150 days before a final decision is rendered on forgiveness or no forgiveness there.
And once if you've submitted an application prior to the repayment period beginning, the the repayment period continues to extend until the SBA funds the bank with the forgiveness portion.
That's correct. That's
That
correct.
was in that last bill.
That's
So,
correct.
in theory, you could extend repayments a substantial ways out by waiting for
In
the bank
theory,
to
you
approve
could
it.
wait until the end of the 10 months, apply, and then you've got up to 150 days or up until the SBA remits payment back to the lender before any payment is due on any unforgiven portion.
I don't know if that qualifies as a strategy or not, but that's a possibility.
Something to consider, certainly. Yeah.
So Tyler, why don't you walk us through kind of what is forgivable, the components of forgivable expenses.
Sure. You know, the big thing is payroll. That's what this program was funded on, payroll protection. And so when this program first came out, there's a requirement of 75% had to be spent on payroll. That has been relaxed in some of the updates in June. So, you know, you're required to spend at least 60% of the loan on payroll. And payroll, that's wages, that's health insurance, dental insurance, 401k match, pension plan expense, even the payroll, you know, the business portion of your payroll taxes can be included in those payroll expenses. In addition to that, there's non-payroll expenses that are allowed to be forgiven. It's rent, lease payments, mortgage interest, utilities. Am I missing anything else? I think that's for non-payroll. That's about that for what can be forgiven.
On mortgage interest, it's not necessarily what we would normally think of as mortgage interest. When we hear mortgage interest, we think, we think a home loan or maybe a loan on a business property, but really it's any loan that's secured by real or personal property. So
yes.
that's a tax or legal speak for, real property would be a building or land, and a personal property could be a car, or it could be if it's secured by your inventory, like a line of credit, or anything else like that. As long as it's secured by personal property in your business, then that's potentially usable expenditure. Now, with the extension to 24 weeks, that becomes less of a problem of making sure you can get it spent. At 8 weeks, we might have had to figure out everything we could to use up the funds or document the use of the funds in an approved way. But with the stretch out to 24 weeks, it becomes a lot easier to just justify it based on payroll.
Sure. And that's something I think that we'll touch on a couple considerations or planning ideas around this later, but that's certainly a good point about the payroll.
Right. And so the expenses, and again, this is another factor that was more important at the 8-week covered period than it is with the 24 weeks, but the expenses could be paid or incurred. The way that the statute reads is paid and incurred, and again, I'm getting into technical accounting speak, but the guidance changed it effectively to paid or incurred. So you say, what the heck does that mean? What it means is that if you had a payroll that the actual period that they were earning was before your covered period, but you paid the cash after you received the funding, you can count that payroll. And if we go to the other end of it, and your people have earned wages on the back end of the covered period that wasn't actually paid in cash, but it was earned, you can count that too. So essentially, they're letting you cram it in on both ends. And that applies to payroll expense. That applies to also the non-payroll items, be it rent or lease, and utilities too. As long as you pay it on the back end, as long as it's incurred and you paid it in the next cycle. So as long as those people earn those wages and you did in fact pay it on the regular pay period, and if you did in fact incur those utilities and you paid it on your next utility bill, those things are includable. So they broadened that up, which was important with the 8-week covered period, but again becomes less important with the 24-week. So Tyler, why don't you walk us forward? Let's talk about some different strategies for filing for forgiveness.
Sure. At one point, I think we kind of hit on a couple times here in the past few minutes is focusing the expenses to payroll. With the extension to 24 weeks, what we have seen Again, going back to another thing you said at the beginning, this is as under current guidance of how the forgiveness process works. With 24 weeks and assuming that we used the 10 weeks of data to get our loan, if we can, get past the 8 weeks, elect to use the 24-week covered period, but isolate our expenditures solely to payroll, it makes the forgiveness application a little bit more streamlined. The administrative burden of having to gather the different information to document non-payroll data, you can get rid of that, and you can really just isolate it to your payroll reports. And so that's a planning strategy that you can use where, okay, if you're looking at, I'm at 8 weeks and I've used all my funds, but I'm using payroll, I'm using rent, I'm using utilities. Well, if you let payroll run for a couple more weeks or however long it takes to fill up that bucket of loan, if you will, you can cut out a lot of the documentation that has to go, and calculations, quite frankly, that have to go into the forgiveness application by doing that.
Right, because the amount of required documentation is pretty substantial, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes. But that could make it from a stack like this, maybe down to a stack like this of information that you have to attach. And if you can limit it straight to payroll, that could be beneficial in streamlining the amount, the volume of documents you have to provide. And your banker will probably thank you for that, I'm guessing. But also, the question I get when we talk about this is, but I put it in an account and I used it for X, Y, and Z. So Tyler, can you address that? We have to, the forgiveness is not necessarily on what you spent the money out of the account on. It's expenditures that you can justify or that you did expend in your business. Can you address that real quick?
It is going back to what we said was forgivable. It's the qualifying expenditures. There's no requirement that it has to be, I'll throw an example out there. Let's say you got a loan for $100,000 and you've got it in a separate PPP account, separate from your normal operating account. For that $100,000 to be forgiven, it does not necessarily have to come directly out of that separate bank account.
You just have to prove that the business spent $100,000 on
You've got to prove that the business spent $100,000. The money's fungible. It can come from your operating account. It can come from the separate PPP funds, but there's not a requirement there for it to come specifically from those dollars.
So the dollars that were in your PPP bank account don't necessarily have to be the same dollars that you claim forgiveness for.
That's exactly right. And backtracking a little bit, or maybe carrying forward, however you want to look at it, after touching on the point of using, isolating just payroll expenses and bumping into the 24-week period, another planning thing or another consideration to take into this is, if you did have full-time equivalent, FTE is the acronym for it that gets thrown around a lot. If you did have a reduction in FTEs or a reduction in wages greater than 25% at some point in your covered period after the 8 weeks, but before the end of the 24 weeks, you can still wait to file for forgiveness after the 24 weeks is up, but elect to use the 8-week period if your loan was funded before June 5th. And so there's some planning ideas going around that. If you did have a situation where, you had had a reduction in hours your employees were working or a reduction in wages there. So, there's different angles to look at it where you could still potentially get full forgiveness. And to that point, on the guidance that was issued back in June, it's a lot more borrower friendly in that if you did have reductions in the hours that your employees were working, reductions in your FTEs due to not being able to operate at normal business capacity that it was back in February, there's a safe harbor where you don't have to do the FTE reduction. You're not going to get a haircut on what's forgiven because because there's been governmental mandates that you can only operate at a certain capacity. And so,
if you were forced to shut down or forced to reduce capacity, then you have an out.
That's exactly right. And, I think a prime example of that is the capacity at restaurants and bars, which is something we've seen going up and down. All of those guys were directly impacted by that. And there's a safe harbor where, they're not going to get hurt because they could only operate at 25 or 50 or 75% capacity.
Okay, good. So, and then I do want to tag onto that and mention that there are various other safe harbors for the FTE calculations and for the wage and salary reduction calculations that relate to people that voluntarily resigned or requested to reduce their hours, or reduce their hours because of COVID sickness. There's a variety of safe harbors. There are people that were fired for cause.
Fired for cause. I was going to add that as well.
Or that were furloughed and then or laid off and then declined an offer to be rehired. You have to document all of those things, but those things will exempt you from the FTE and the wage and salary calculations with respect to that individual. So there are some provisions in there that helps make it a little more fair. So I'm gonna move on and talk about when you can file. Some banks are accepting applications right now. Some banks are waiting to accept applications, but bankers will be able to begin submitting applications to the SBA on August the 10th. So if you've given an application to a bank so far, the bank may have approved it already, but they can't submit it to the SBA for their review until beginning on August 10th at the earliest. So the other thing is that if there's additional legislation that passes between now and August 10th, that go live date might get delayed as well. So we'll see what happens. We're a little bit in a wait and see moment, and I think it's going to be important for most people, and particularly those that are under 150,000 with their loan, to wait and see what happens in this next round of legislation that hopefully will pass in the next week or two. Let's see. So really that's the date. The other thing is we do have a whole lot of unanswered questions to the SBA. So we would expect that there would be, in addition to the legislation, there should be additional FAQs and answers to frequently asked questions, and IFRs. We throw all these acronyms around, but that's their rulemaking authority of the Treasury Department. So we expect more of that to come out in the coming weeks. I'm going to run through and talk to you about the different forgiveness forms that are out there that you will be, or you may hire somebody like us to prepare on your behalf, or you can prepare it on your behalf. It's the Form 3508, and there's two different versions of the Form 3508. There's the regular full form, and there's the EZ form. And obviously the EZ form is shorter and requires a different amount of documentation and a different amount of support for it. And the calculations are, well, they're comparable, but there's a few fewer of them. So the first question we always get is, when can I use the EZ form? So number one, there's three different scenarios where you can use the EZ form. The first one is if you're self-employed and you file your taxes on a Schedule C on your 1040 and you have no employees, you can automatically use the EZ form. The second situation is if you did not have any reduction of any individual's wage rate or salary of more than 25% compared to the first quarter of 2020, your covered period compared to the first quarter of 2020, and you didn't have a reduction in your full-time equivalent employees, FTEs, from 1/1 of 2020 through the end of the covered period. And again, there's a few exceptions for those specific individual employee situations. So those are the two situations, Schedule C, or you meet those other two requirements. Or the third scenario is if you didn't have any reduction of any individual's wage rate or salary of more than 25% compared to the first quarter of 2020, the covered period compared to the first quarter of 2020, and you were unable to operate at the same level of business activity due to compliance with a governmental requirement to reduce your capacity or shut down due to COVID. So those are the 3 times with multiple scenarios where you can use the EZ form. Everybody else has to use the full form. It's interesting to note that there's no maximum limit to the size of a loan that can use the EZ form. I assumed that there would be, if you had over $2 million loan, you wouldn't be able to use the EZ form, but that's not the case. If you do have a loan over $2 million and you qualify to use the EZ form, you just have to check a box. So that being said, Tyler, you want to walk through, kind of briefly what the documentation required is with the EZ form?
Yeah, sure. So again, the EZ's am I getting feedback over there? Apologize for that. The EZ form is abbreviated in the, I think really what it does, it eliminates a lot of the full-time equivalent FTE calculations, and your wage reduction calculations that have to be presented on the form. It's not saying that you don't have to do those calculations, because technically in the background, you're supposed to do those calculations and maintain that documentation.
You have to attest that you made those calculations and you pass.
Right. You've got to attest that you did it, and you've got to hang on to those, but it doesn't get attached to the forgiveness application, and you don't have to submit it with the form to your lender. So what do you have to submit? Key things, because it is heavily focused on, on payroll. For payroll expenses, you've got to include bank statements or third-party payroll reports to show that whatever you're putting for your payroll expense does in fact tie to what your payroll was. You've also got to include payroll tax filings or a third-party payroll service equivalent to your tax filings. Receipts or canceled checks that tie to that, to tie to what your payroll expenses are. And you've also got to include what your average number of FTEs were at the beginning of the year. And, again, you're not including the full calculation of your FTEs, but you got to show, hey, here's where we started for our FTEs. Here's where we ended. We're not going to show you all the ups and downs to get there. For non-payroll expenses, for your mortgage interest payments, you got to include an amortization schedule or receipts or canceled checks that tie to those payments. For lease payments, you got to attach a copy of a lease agreement or canceled checks that tie to your expenses. Utility payments, you've got to attach either canceled checks or statements showing your utility payments. Not only for the covered period, but also for February, to show that those utilities were in fact in place before you got your PPP loan. And so those are the documentations of the expenses that are going to go on that EZ form that have to be submitted. Additionally, you've got to maintain support for certain expenses or certain calculations that aren't going to be submitted with the form. Again, talking about the FTEs, you got to maintain that documentation, but it's not going to be submitted. And that's going to be your calculation for your FTEs, and also your tracking and calculation of any wage reduction, just to certify that there were no wage reductions greater than 25%. Again, going back to some of the safe harbors that we talked about on FTE reductions that were either caused by an employee voluntarily leaving, or employees that were furloughed and then offered a position back and refused it. Just generally speaking, items like that, you do have to maintain documentation that, either the employee left of their own accord, the employee refused an offer to come back to work, things of that nature, just to support that you did not, in fact, have an FTE reduction. And then again, if you fell under one of the safe harbors where you were unable to operate at normal business that you were back at the first of the year, you've got to maintain some kind of documentation that there was an order in place or mandate that directly affected you and your ability to operate at full capacity. Looking down through here, I think it's similar.
Tell us about the difference. Ooh, I'm getting feedback now. Tell us about the difference between what you would file the documentation required for the EZ form versus the full form?
Sure. So I think it's anything that you file with your EZ would also be attached to your full form, but the full form just takes it a little bit further in that what the full form requires you to do is to do your FTE, your full-time equivalent calculation, on an employee by employee basis, pay period by pay period. So for each payroll run that you had during your covered period that you're using, whether it's 8 weeks or 24 weeks, you have to show a calculation to the borrower that shows, what the employee was being paid each pay period, and also the hours that they were working. Now, if you've got only full-time employees, that makes it a little bit easier. But if you're in a line of business where you've got a lot of part-time employees or variable time employees, it becomes a tedious task of showing what the hours were worked for each pay period. And so that's really the additional detail that would be submitted with the full form. Also, on the full form, if you did have to, if you didn't qualify for one of the FTE safe harbors, you've got to calculate all your FTEs for, your comparison period. And so there's a little bit of choice there. You can pick a period of time in 2019, or you can you can pick the first 2 months of 2020. But you got to present that data as well to show that, when you're calculating your FTE reduction quotient, it's a mouthful, but when you're calculating that, that's what it's based off of. And so you've got to show the support for all of that as well.
So the sad reality, I think, is that we're going to have some applications that have, over 1,000 pages of documents that have to be attached to it.
Easily.
Yeah. When you're providing payroll inflow for the whole period and a comparison period and the FTE calculations, and if you're doing non-payroll expenses, the copy of your lease and the copy of your utility bills for multiple periods and all that kind of stuff, it adds up to a big stack of papers. So that kind of underlines the importance of one of the prior strategies that we talked about of potentially spreading out electing the longer forgiveness period so that you can include only payroll expenses and eliminate some of that additional documentation that's required. So that's, that could make a big difference to the amount of documents your banker has to look at. So I know this is probably Greek to a lot of people, and it's fairly complicated, and you might argue that it's more complicated than necessary. And so that's why there's a big push for simplification for small borrowers. And so, why, in our opinion, we think you're probably more likely to see some action on a streamlined process for borrowers under 150,000. If both parties of Congress, both parties of the legislators in Congress are agreeing about that, it's likely to happen. And Treasury doesn't seem to be opposed to it because it really kind of decreases their workload. So that underlines the fact that if you have less than 150 specifically, I definitely would wait until we know the results of this next round of legislation. I think we have a couple of questions. So Tyler, anything you want to hit back on or that we missed or anything before we take some questions?
I mean, obviously we could get as detailed as we wanted on these things, but I think, trying to keep it as high level as possible, I think we covered that with, when to file, what's got to be included, the timing, and again, specifically to the smaller borrowers, it doesn't hurt. Waiting is not going to hurt you, and it could, we could see a much easier process for forgiveness there.
And the other thing I want to point out, we're talking about this process and it is kind of complicated. At JRBT, we're here to help y'all. We will prepare applications of PPP, the 3508s for clients. Even if you're not an existing client, you give us a call. we can help with the preparation of those things and prepare it for your signature to submit to the bank. And then also, if you want to do it yourself and you are having problems with certain aspects of it or what's required, we're also available to consult with respect to that. So even if you're a DIYer and you get stuck and you need a question answered or a little bit of assistance, we're here to help you with that as well. So I think, Rick, are you going to run a couple questions by us, or Matt?
Sure. We have a few questions that have come in. First, though, before I read the questions to you, gentlemen, thank you. Very, very informative. Really appreciate you joining us and providing that information. It's a lot to take in, you're right. One of the questions that we received is related to just the management of all of this information, all of these numbers, all of your people and so forth. Is there anything available in the marketplace that would allow an employer, would make it easier, a software package of some sort, something that would make it easier, that would be specific to the management of PPP funding?
So I think there are a few different platforms that are trying to get fired up to assist folks in doing this. And Tyler, you may be aware of more than I am, but I know one specifically that I can think of, and I think the link is ppp.bank. It was a joint venture between Mark Cuban and a bank somewhere, a regional bank somewhere, that they were trying to create a platform that would assist people in helping them with the preparation of their PPP forgiveness applications. Does that sound right to you, Tyler?
That's right. That was the one I was going to point to. I believe I saw this morning there's another one, another free one that has come out since then. The name escapes me, but it's something that I think we will likely see more of in the coming weeks, right, especially with the fact that we actually have a date set for when the SBA will start accepting the applications from the banks or the lenders, and I think we'll likely see that more. I know there's the AICPA has also put out a tool for CPAs, but it's not for the general public, so that doesn't really help your standard borrower.
The other thing is, I know that Intuit, which is the company that makes QuickBooks, I believe they may have a tool as well. I haven't researched that, but I think I remember seeing emails and that kind of stuff about that. Intuit is pretty progressive and forward-thinking as far as that goes. So if you use QuickBooks, certainly, and want to do it yourself, I would investigate the tools that Intuit has.
Awesome. Thanks, guys. Another question for you, and I think you touched on this. I think we may have answered this, but let me ask this question. It says, what happens if you don't have a reduction in full-time equivalent, FTEs, but you have a reduction in hours for certain employees? So basically, some employees' hours got reduced, but this company also hired new employees, so the total FTE is not reduced, just specific employees' hours got reduced.
You want to field that, Tyler?
Sure. Obviously, we would need to work through the calculation to see exactly what happened, but you would count the hours from your new employees. That would go into the calculation. And even though you are tracking it on an employee by employee basis, the number that actually goes into the full FTE quotient, if you will, is the aggregate of all of those. So even if you cut hours for some employees but added employees, you might get to the fact where you have the same total FTE amount or even greater. So you're not going to get, in this specific situation, you wouldn't necessarily be hurt because you had employees that had hours reduced.
But depending on how that person is paid, that could go into the wage and salary reduction calculation. Sure.
Now you can have, you're not going to get hit both ways here with the FTE reduction and the wage solely by decreasing an employee's hours. If you have an employee and you reduce their hour, if you cut their hours in half, but their hourly rate remains the same, their wage rate remains the same, then it's only going to be the FTE reduction that gets considered. But if you also decrease their wages, then you've got to look at, if you decrease their rate greater than 25%, you got to look at both the FTE reduction and wage reduction.
Yeah, I think that's something that a lot of people have a little confusion on with respect to the wage and salary reduction calculations. If you have an employee that you're paying $15 an hour and they were working 40 hours a week, and then for whatever reason they go to 15 hours a week, but you're still paying them $15 an hour, that is not considered a reduction for the wage and salary reduction. As long as the rate of pay on an hourly employee is the same, you're good. However, if that person was paid as salary and their salary got reduced, then that would be considered a reduction.
Okay, good, thank you. Another question, if you use the PPP loan just for payroll at the end of 15 weeks, do we still need to have the same number of employees at the end of 24 weeks?
Tyler, that touches on something you and I have been talking about. Why don't you take that one too?
That is a very, very interesting question, and that's not the first time we've seen or thought through this. So if you look at the instructions, specifically what it says, and one of the FAQs that was released in June or after June, it said that borrowers that are using the 24-week covered period, they can apply early before the end of the 24 week. They can apply for forgiveness early before the end of the 24 weeks if all of the loan proceeds have been spent. And so to your point, if you get to 15 weeks, you've spent all of your you've spent all of your proceeds, and you're ready to apply for forgiveness, then you can apply for forgiveness at the end of 15 weeks. What we don't have specific guidance on is, let's say in this situation, you used all your funds in 15 weeks, but you waited until after the 24-week period to apply for forgiveness. We don't know if you can elect for a 15-week covered period, or if because you waited until the end that you are in fact, stuck with either 8 or 24 weeks. The way that the guidance reads, it would seem that you're stuck with either 8 or 24 weeks. And so again, going back to the planning, at least how guidance stands right now, there's open interpretation on how that would, or that's open to interpretation, because the guidance does, not to go off on too much of a tangent, it does specifically speak to wage reductions. And so in this scenario where, let's say you spent all of your funds in 15 weeks, but you did have some wage reductions, those wage reductions get extrapolated over the full 24 weeks. And so even though you're applying for forgiveness early, your wage reduction quotient would be as if it were over the full 24 weeks. And so it seems that it would be a similar situation for your FTE reductions.
Okay.
So
I don't know if you have anything to add to that.
It's a confusing answer.
Yeah, it's
well. We may be more confused than when we started, and unfortunately that's the nature of this beast, is that it's complicated, and there are areas that we don't have full guidance on, and hopefully the areas of uncertainty will get closed by the SBA providing guidance on how these things are supposed to be done. But as you could imagine, there are literally millions of different scenarios that could come up, and I mean, obviously we have to do a good faith effort of interpreting what we do know as of today as to how it should be applied. But again, like we said in the beginning, all this stuff is subject to change. The SBA could issue a regulation specific to that question tomorrow, and we'd have an answer. But as of today, we don't have a real clear answer. Okay, good. Thank you. Last question, I believe. Let me see. Oh, no, we've got a few more. Okay. A friend communicating to me. Last question I have for you, gentlemen, kind of near and dear to my heart, is we're looking at CARES 4, and these negotiations are hopefully progressing and soon to conclude.
we'll see how this unfolds. Do you anticipate that there might be some hope for 501c6 organizations to be able to be eligible for PPP funding? Heretofore, 501c6s have been excluded. 501c3s have been included.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you know, that's a difficult question to answer. I think it's easy to make the argument that 501c6s have been just as impacted as 501c3s and for-profit businesses. I think it's more of a question of politics than a question of economic need. And you know, I'll say that they have opened it up a little bit more. Based on the original, what was in the statute, they were a little liberal in opening it up to a few other types of businesses along the way and clarifying that certain types of businesses were in fact allowed to do it. You know, I think ultimately it depends on what gets negotiated in this next round. And I mean, you know, as we said before, they're basically $2 trillion apart on you know, on their negotiations, that they've got to close the gap, you know, maybe within a week. And it really, you know, we try not to speculate too much on bills in progress, because ultimately you don't get too far. You don't want to get too far down the road by analyzing a bill in progress, because ultimately what you're looking at may not be what's in the end, what happens. Do I think that the Treasury is going to do that by regulation or guidance? No, I don't. I don't think they're going to do it without clear indication legislatively from Congress. And so ultimately, it depends on whether it's in the bill or not. And, you know, we get surprised all the time with what ends up in a final bill and what doesn't end up in a final bill. So I guess we just have to hold our breath. I know certainly there's a need there. I mean, there is. And I understand that, and we appreciate that. But, you know, we'll certainly help once, if it does get included, we're certainly happy to help. So
Appreciate it. Great. Well, gentlemen, that's the extent of our questions today. Michael, Tyler, we really appreciate you taking time to be with us and to share kind of real time where we are with PPP. Complicated still, undefined to some degree, but very, very helpful. So guys, thank you. And we're so grateful to JRBT for all that your company does to support our community and support our chamber. And we appreciate that as well. So we're going to close. I'm going to close by again expressing our warmest thanks to our sponsors, Spectrum Reach and First National Bank of Central Texas. We appreciate you folks very much. As Rick said, that's the lifeblood of the organization, and we appreciate your support. We have another business power hour tentatively scheduled for August the 25th. We haven't identified topic yet, but we'll get that out to you folks. And to all of you who participated today, thank you very much. And to all of you who support your chamber, we're grateful to you. Guys, thanks again. We appreciate it. Everybody have a great day.
thanks, Matt.
Take care.
Thanks, Rick. Y'all take care.
Thank you.